Algebra 2, Target 7. I can operate within the complex number system. Today our focus is going to be A, what is a complex number? And B, how do I add and subtract with complex numbers? Let's start with a few questions. What is the square root of 4? Well, the square root of 4 is 2. Why is it 2? Well, because 2 squared is 4. What is the square root of 25? Well, that's 5 because 5 times 5 is 25. 5 squared is 25. What is the square root of negative 1? That one you should be saying, what is the square root of negative 1? Well, there's no way to do that. There is no real number where we can square it and get negative 1. A negative 1 times a negative 1 equals a positive 1. Positive 1 times a positive 1 equals positive 1. So there is no real number that works. So we get creative and we'd say, okay, let's imagine a number. And so we get our imaginary unit. Let's imagine or create and define an imaginary unit I so that when we square it, we get negative 1. So when we say I, what we mean is the square root of negative 1. So what is the square root of negative 1? Well, the square root of negative 1 is I. And then I squared equals negative 1. All right, some properties of this. If r is positive, the square root of negative r is we can pull out this negative 1 and just write I times the square root of r. For example, the square root of negative 3 is I times the square root of 3. You're pulling the negative 1 out. Really, it's the square root of negative 3. That's the same thing as saying square root of negative 1 times the square root of 3. And we already know that that's I. So that's I square root of 3. And we can square the whole thing. The square root of I times the square root of r all squared is negative r, because I times the square root of r squared, we'll square everything in parentheses, I squared, square root of r squared. I squared we already said is negative 1 times r, which is negative r. All right, and so that brings us to complex numbers. Complex numbers are a combination of real and imaginary. All right, a complex number has a real component and an imaginary component. Real numbers, you are very familiar with those. We've been working with those for all of your life so far. Negative 1, that's real. 5 halves, that's real. Pi is real. Square root of 2 is real. All right. And then purely imaginary numbers, those are just numbers with I in them. Negative 4i, 6i, that's where we got the square root of negative 1. That's 4, negative 4 times the square root of negative 1, 6 times the square root of negative 1. And then a complex number, which also is imaginary, has a real and imaginary component. We combine them, just add them up. Add the real and the imaginary component together to get your complex number. So imaginary is a complex number with real and imaginary components. And a pure imaginary number is one where the real component is 0. Okay? So let's look at how do we add and subtract complex numbers. Their definition of adding and subtracting in the textbook says you're going to take a plus bi, c plus di. You're going to add your real components, add your imaginary components. All right? Effectively, what you're doing is you're going to treat I like a variable. It's not a variable, it's a number, but you're going to treat it like a variable and just combine like terms. Your like terms are your imaginary components. And then for difference, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to combine your like terms, combine your real components, and combine your imaginary components. Treat it like a variable, even though it's not, it's a number. but you're still going to have like components, your imaginary components and your imaginary components and your real components. Excuse me there. So some examples. Write the expression as a complex number in standard form. Remember, in standard form, we got your real component first, and then your imaginary component. All right? So let's combine like terms. We're adding, so we want to combine the real components, 8 plus 5, plus combine your imaginary components, -1 plus 4i. 8 plus 5, that's 13. -1 plus 4, 3i. So in standard form, this complex number is 13 plus 3i. Here's another example. Give it a try before I go through it. This time it's subtraction. All right. When we were dealing with real numbers, we distribute the negative, and we can still do that. So we got 7 minus 6i, minus 3 plus 6i. All right, let's combine like terms, get the real components together and the imaginary components together. So this will be 7 minus 3 minus 6i plus 6i. All right, combine here. 7 minus 3 is 4. -6i plus 6i cancels, so this is 4. You can add two imaginary numbers and get a real number. All right, one final example. Combine like terms. All right, write in standard form. Try it before I go through it. So let's start. We'll distribute our negative. We got 10 minus 6 minus 7i plus 4i. And let's go ahead then and combine like terms. 10 minus 6, that's 4. -7i plus 3i is minus 3i. So in standard form, we got 4 minus 3i. So that's complex numbers. A complex number is a number that has a real component and an imaginary component. Your imaginary component is the square root of -1. So a complex number is a real component and an imaginary component. And to add or subtract complex numbers, what you'll do, you'll just treat I just like you would a variable, even though it's not.